Evelyn stands alone in the hollowed-out shell of the Millbrook Public Library on its final day, her palm resting against the massive oak desk in the reference room. The wood feels like ice beneath her fingers. It is heavy, stubborn, and ancient. This desk has anchored this corner since 1987, supporting the weight of city maps and planning documents, while the town around it slowly withered away. Everyone told her to walk away from it. The movers said it was too heavy to haul, the municipal council labelled it as junk, and even her own daughter called the impulse nothing more than hoarding. Her old colleagues couldn't understand why she wanted a scarred relic from a dying institution, but Evelyn felt a pull she couldn't explain. The desk seemed to be holding on to something more than just empty drawers and yellowed paper. She found herself haunted by a single question. Why would a retired librarian risk her reputation and her limited garage space for a piece of furniture the rest of the world had already discarded? Finding that answer would take years of her life, and it would eventually cost the town of Millbrook every comfortable lie it told itself about its own history. 34 years of Evelyn's life had been poured into the Millbrook Public Library, a career spent cataloguing books for a community that seemed to stop reading. The branch sat on Elm Street in a sturdy stone building that served as a bank in the 1920s, back when the town had more money than it knew what to do with. By the time Evelyn walked through the doors for her first shift in 1985, the golden age of Millbrook was already a memory. The mills had gone silent and the factories were boarded up, leaving the families who built the town to pack their bags and take their futures elsewhere. The desk arrived during a City Hall renovation in 1987, appearing one afternoon as a nameless donation from the planning office. No one bothered to ask where it came from or who had sat behind it before it was rolled into the reference room. It was a beast of dark oak with a double base and brass handles that had turned a sickly shade of green with age. Evelyn still remembered the metallic rasp of the wood scraping the doorframe as the movers struggled to shove it into the corner. Once it settled, it looked like it had been carved directly out of the floorboards. For over 3 decades, those heavy drawers held the blueprints of a town that once dreamed big. People used to come to Evelyn to ask about property lines or the layout of streets that didn't exist anymore, and she would watch them trace the old maps with their shaking fingers. It was as if they were trying to touch a version of home that couldn't be taken away by a closing factory or a foreclosed mortgage. By the summer of 2019, the life had completely drained out of the building, leaving only a few elderly residents reading the morning papers and teenagers looking for a signal. The municipal council finally voted to consolidate the branches, which meant the Millbrook doors were locking for good. Everything was being moved to the central library downtown, a 15-minute drive that might as well have been 100 miles for the neighbours who didn't own cars. Closing day arrived in June, and the air inside the library felt thick with the scent of old paper and grief. Evelyn spent her final hours labelling furniture for the auction block or the dumpster, touching the spine of every book like she was saying goodbye to an old friend. She walked past the yellowed local history section and the chipped chairs in the children's corner, feeling like she was presiding over a funeral for the town's collective memory. When the auction company finally reached the reference desk, they didn't even bother to put a price tag on it. The top was ruined by a dark, deep stain that looked like something had been leaking there for decades, and the finish was cracked and scarred beyond repair. They called it dumpster material, a piece of trash too heavy to be worth the effort of moving. That was the moment Evelyn made a choice that her friends called foolish and her family called a mistake. She decided the desk was coming home with her. It took 4 grown men to heave the oak beast into her garage, where it swallowed up nearly every square inch of floor space. Her daughter was so frustrated by the decision that she didn't visit for 3 months, and her former co-workers offered polite, pitying smiles about the importance of letting go. Evelyn didn't try to defend herself or explain the impulse she didn't fully understand. She just stood in the dim light of her garage, staring at the scarred wood, and felt a heavy, quiet certainty that this desk wasn't finished with her yet. One afternoon, the winter light cuts through the garage at a sharp angle, and Evelyn finally sees what she had missed before. The stain on the desk's surface isn't just a random mark from a leaky roof or a forgotten glass. It spreads across the wood like old blood that soaked deep into the grain years ago, concentrated heavily in one corner. The edges have darkened to a shade that is almost black, while the center has faded into a dull rust brown. She stands there staring at the blemish, and the air in the garage feels suddenly heavy as something in her chest begins to tighten. She decides to clean it, so she grabs a cloth and a bucket of water to begin the work. She scrubs at the mark with her fingertips, pressing her full weight into the wood, but the stain refuses to budge. Water simply beads up and rolls off the surface, as if the wood had been sealed against her, or as if the desk itself was determined to hold something back. She scrubs even harder until her knuckles ache and the cloth turns dark with grime, yet the mark remains exactly as it was. It has been there far too long, and now it is simply part of the wood. She tries the top drawer next, but it is completely stuck in place. The wood has either swollen from the dampness or settled over the decades, and the drawer won't budge no matter how hard she pulls. She eventually works a butter knife under the edge to find some leverage, and the wood lets out a long, low groan. It is a sound like something old and tired being forced to give up its secrets, but the resistance finally breaks and the drawer slides open. Inside, she finds a collection of maps that are folded tight and feel brittle to the touch. There are city planning documents from the 1950s, elevation surveys, and property line diagrams that seem entirely unremarkable at first glance. It looks like nothing more than ordinary paper that someone deemed important enough to keep in a locked drawer, only to have it be forgotten for the next 70 years. But the stain on the top still bothers her, and she finds that she can't stop thinking about why it looks the way it does. It isn't random, and it certainly didn't come from a spilled cup of coffee or a leaky ceiling. The concentration of the discoloration is far too precise, looking as if something heavy had sat on that specific corner for a generation. Something leaked there, staining the wood before it was eventually removed, and leaving only this dark ghost of itself behind. She runs her fingers along the underside of the top drawer, where the wood feels rough and unfinished. This hidden side is nothing like the smooth, polished exterior the world was meant to see. As she moves her hand, she feels a seam, a tiny gap that shouldn't exist in a drawer made of solid wood. She traces the line with her fingernail and realizes the gap is thin, maybe the width of a playing card, running perfectly along the bottom edge. A double base is what they called it, and she remembers hearing the term years ago during a conservation class at the library. Some desks from that era were built with a false bottom, creating a hidden compartment for valuables or things you wanted to keep safe but needed to keep close. She kneels down on the cold concrete to examine the base of the desk, running her hands along the underside where the wood has warped from age. Sections of the frame are rough and splintered, but then her fingers catch on something metal. It is a small latch, corroded to a pale green verdigris, and nearly invisible under decades of garage grime and dust. She traces the metal with her thumb, and the coldness of it sends a shiver through her because it feels like it has been waiting a very long time to be touched. Her hands begin to shake as she tries to work the catch using a flathead screwdriver. She applies pressure slowly, terrified that the brittle metal might snap under the strain, and she carefully works it back and forth in tiny increments. 5 minutes pass, then 10, but the catch is stubborn and refuses to move. It has been locked for so long that it seems to have forgotten how to open, Or perhaps it simply doesn't want to. 15 minutes turn into 20. Then, something finally gives, and the catch shifts with a sharp mechanical snap. It is the sound of a lock breaking, that precise and terrifying moment when metal finally yields to force. It is the sound of something that has been sealed for a lifetime, finally cracking open. Evelyn's hands are shaking violently now, and while she isn't sure what she is looking for, her body already knows that she has found something life-changing. The false bottom slides open with a smoothness that surprises her, moving as if the mechanism had been waiting for this exact moment. It feels as though the desk has been holding its breath for 32 years, and now it is finally exhaling. The smell hits her first, a thick layer of mustiness that fills the small space between her and the desk. But beneath that scent is something sharper and more chemical, like old ink and preservation wax. It is the unmistakable smell of careful storage, the kind of scent you find on documents treated with the deep respect you give to things that truly matter. It is the smell of secrets kept in the dark. She pulls out the first bundle slowly, but the oilcloth wrapping it crumbles the moment she touches it. The fabric disintegrates like grey ash, flaking away to reveal stacks of certificates and municipal bonds printed on heavy stock paper. This is the kind of paper that doesn't rot, the kind of expensive material that was manufactured specifically to last through the centuries. The ink has faded from a vibrant blue to a ghostly grey, but the letters are still clear enough for her to read. The dates jump out at her from the page: 1931, 1933, and 1935, all from the height of the Depression era. Each bond is printed with the figure $50,000 in both numerals and formal words. She counts the stack in her hands and finds 20 bonds, then she counts again and finds 30. She sets them down carefully on the garage floor and reaches back into the dark compartment. There are more, dozens of stacks wrapped in paper and labelled with handwritten numbers. She pulls them all out one by one, working slowly and methodically, even though her heart is racing. She arranges the bonds on the concrete floor, spreading them out until it looks like she has laid bare the evidence of an entire hidden life. Each bond is worth $50,000, and every single one is dated, verified, and recorded with obsessive care. 20 stacks become 40, and 40 becomes 60, with each bundle containing multiple bonds. Evelyn knows how to read these because she spent years cataloguing financial records for the library. She had seen municipal debt records and pension fund statements before, but she does the math slowly now, not trusting her own mind. She doesn't trust her hands to stay steady enough to calculate the total correctly. There are 2,240 bonds in total. The math adds up to $112 million. In today's money, that figure would be much, much higher. She sits back on her heels, breathing hard as the reality of the numbers sinks in. The math doesn't change no matter how many times she runs the numbers in her head, and the total remains impossible, yet concrete. It is true, and it is sitting right there on the floor of her garage. There is a ledger too, wrapped separately in wax paper that is held up much better than the oilcloth. The leather cover is dry and cracked, but still intact, and she opens it to find handwriting that is precise and methodical. It isn't the writing of someone panicking or hiding in a fit of shame, but rather the work of someone keeping careful, professional records. It belongs to someone who wanted the truth documented, even if that truth had to be buried for a while. Each bond is listed by date and initialed, with serial numbers verified and notations made in the margins. One entry from 1936 is circled in red ink, a splash of colour that stands out against the black. Someone clearly wanted that particular entry to be noticed, and next to it they had written a single word: recovered. She finds letters as well, envelopes containing formal correspondence between the city treasurer and a man named Hartwell. The handwriting on the envelopes is faded but still legible, with "From the office of the city treasurer" embossed at the top. She opens one carefully, feeling the brittle edge of the paper scrape against her fingertips. "Dear Mr. Hartwell," the letter begins, "regarding the situation you outlined in your previous letter, the Council has voted unanimously to proceed with discretion." Another letter mentions embezzlement, though the word isn't used directly in the text. It is there, however, circled in pencil with the words "alleged embezzlement" written nearby. Another note mentions a cover-up, using the phrase "secured against future claims" to hide the true meaning. The most recent entry in the ledger is from 1987, which was the same year the desk was donated to the library. A single line is written in the careful hand: "Transfer to safekeeping, M.H." Someone had moved these bonds from the city planning office to the library, trusting that in the new age of digital records, no one would ever care about an old wooden desk. They trusted that a retired librarian wouldn't ask the questions that everyone else in town had stopped asking decades ago. Evelyn sits on the garage floor, surrounded by documents that effectively rewrite the entire history of her town. She begins to photograph everything with her phone, her hands shaking as she frames each bond and each page of the ledger. The camera captures the evidence in the grey, dying light coming through the garage window. The library hadn't just been closed because of simple budget cuts or a lack of interest. It had been closed because someone powerful wanted the truth to stay buried in the basement, and that truth had been sitting in her garage the whole time, just waiting for someone to find it. Stay with us as we uncover the justice hidden in the dust. The county records office smells like stale dust and the hum of flickering fluorescent lights. Evelyn spends the next week buried in that basement, pulling microfiche from heavy steel cabinets that haven't been touched since the 90s. A young librarian, who doesn't recognize Evelyn from her years in Millbrook, keeps bringing her stack after stack of yellowed newspapers. She digs through the Millbrook Gazette and the County Register, searching through local history archives that most people have long since forgotten. The story doesn't come to her all at once, but instead emerges in jagged fragments. She works with the slow patience of someone uncovering a truth that was meant to stay buried forever. Back in 1933, the city treasurer was a man named Marcus Hartwell, and his name appeared in the papers constantly. One headline praised him for overseeing a new public works initiative, while another announced he was distributing bonds for municipal infrastructure. He looked confident in those old photographs, always smiling like a man who truly believed he was building a legacy. Everything changed in 1936, when the articles suddenly stopped mentioning him entirely. There is a 3-month gap where his name vanishes from every municipal announcement, followed by a tiny article that would be easy to miss. The headline claimed the city council had recovered misappropriated bonds, choosing a soft word that sounded more like a clerical error than a federal crime. According to the report, the treasurer had taken $32 million worth of bonds meant for depression relief work. The article stated he had returned the funds, and the city council voted unanimously to move forward without filing any criminal charges. They declared the matter closed, but as Evelyn looks at the evidence, she realizes it was actually just being hidden away. Evelyn pulls more microfiche and finds the real story hiding underneath the official version. She discovers a letter to the editor from a former planning office worker titled "The Truth About Our City's Future." The paper never ran the piece, and a penciled note in the margin says the editor declined to publish it. Someone at the Gazette knew the truth, but someone else with more power told them to keep it out of the print. She finds a photo of Hartwell from 1932, standing in front of the new municipal building while the cornerstone was still fresh. His suit is perfectly tailored and his smile is broad, looking like a man who believed Millbrook actually had a future. The math in the ledger from her garage finally starts to make sense, showing a total of $112 million instead of 32. The official recovery was a lie designed to cover up a much larger theft, and it seems someone made a secret deal with Hartwell. They told him to return a portion of the bonds in exchange for his freedom and a clean reputation. The reason for the cover-up sits right there in the articles from the following year. The town's industrial base was incredibly fragile, and no bank would lend money to a city that harbored a high-profile embezzler. A scandal of that size would have destroyed Millbrook's credit and accelerated the decline that was already starting to take hold. To save the town's image, the council chose a path of total silence. Hartwell left town without a sound, the bonds were tucked away, and the city told its creditors that everything was fine. Evelyn eventually finds his obituary in a 1961 Arizona newspaper, which reveals he died a very wealthy man. The notice describes him as a successful real estate developer with a long career out west, but it never mentions Millbrook or the theft. His family lived their lives believing he was a good man, and in a strange way, the silence of the town made that lie a reality. The embezzlement became something that never happened because no one was ever allowed to speak the truth. For 51 years, those bonds sat in a desk inside a city planning office until it was renovated in 1987. Perhaps the last surviving council member donated the desk to the library, thinking it was a place where the secret would be safe and forgotten. A retired librarian who didn't ask questions ended up inheriting a secret that an entire generation had spent half a century protecting. Evelyn sits in the records office, surrounded by old archives, and understands something cold. That silence had protected everyone except the town itself. Evelyn calls the county clerk's office on a Tuesday morning to report what she found in the old desk. There is a long, heavy pause on the other end of the line before a clerk named Dorothy explains the protocol for unclaimed property. She says the bonds are subject to state law and must be turned over to the state treasurer's office immediately. Evelyn agrees to the transfer, but her mind is back in the garage where the heat is pressing down on the paper. Before she can even start making the arrangements, a lawyer calls her out of the blue. His name is David Kessler, and he claims to represent the descendants of the Hartwell family. They discovered her inquiry through public records, and he speaks with the careful, practiced tone of someone reading from a script. He admits that Marcus Hartwell took the bonds, but he argues they were never legally recovered by the city. Since the official recovery was a cover story, the bonds technically never left Hartwell's legal possession, meaning they are still part of his private estate. According to Kessler, the Hartwell family is the only rightful heir to the fortune sitting in Evelyn's garage. Evelyn listens to the argument and realizes how clean and persuasive it sounds to someone who doesn't know the history. She knows the truth now, and she understands that the silence was a conspiracy between a thief and a desperate city council. She turns down Kessler's initial offer, and he politely tells her that he will be in touch very soon. The next day, she hires a lawyer named Sarah Chen, a sharp woman in her 40s who specializes in municipal law. Sarah listens to the entire story about the desk and the ledger before explaining a reality that makes Evelyn's chest feel tight. The ownership of the bonds is a legal nightmare because they could belong to 4 different parties at once. The state wants them as unclaimed property, while the original creditors could claim them because they were meant for depression relief. The Hartwell estate is fighting for them as part of an inheritance, and the town of Millbrook wants them to fix its crumbling infrastructure. There are 4 different claims and 4 different groups of lawyers, all fighting over 4 very different futures for the money. The story breaks in the local news a week later, with a headline calling her a retired librarian who discovered a hidden fortune. The article mentions her name and her years of service at the library, making her sound more like a lucky treasure hunter than a witness to history. By the following morning, the Millbrook Town Council has already called an emergency meeting to claim the money for the community. They argue the bonds should be used to build new infrastructure and spark the economic development the town so desperately needs. The state treasurer opens an official investigation, and federal authorities get involved because the bonds involve old federal relief programs. The IRS starts asking about tax implications, while forensic accountants are brought in to examine the paper under UV light. Lawyers begin to swarm the town, and Evelyn's quiet garage suddenly becomes a high-stakes legal battleground. She is forced to sit through 2 long depositions, where they grill her about how she found the desk and what she intends to do. When they ask if she wants the money for herself, she says no, but she also tells them it isn't her place to decide if the town gets it. They ask her what she actually wants, and she realizes she doesn't have a simple answer for them. The bonds are confirmed as authentic within a few weeks, but the question of who actually owns them remains a mess. The Hartwell family eventually comes forward with a personal offer of $5 million just for Evelyn. All she has to do is drop her claim and sign a non-disclosure agreement that would keep the story quiet forever. Her lawyer tells her she should take the deal because it represents total financial security for the rest of her life. But Evelyn thinks about the empty library on Elm Street and the way the town slowly withered away while the money sat in a drawer. She remembers the physical weight of that desk and why she felt so compelled to save it from the trash. She looks at the paperwork and simply refuses to sign the settlement. Stay with us as we uncover the justice hidden in the dust. The case finally reached the state court in 2021, 3 full years after Evelyn first pulled those bonds from the belly of the desk. The courtroom felt modern and sterile, a cold space designed to look neutral that actually felt like it belonged entirely to the powerful. On one side sat the Hartwell family, flanked by a lawyer named Richardson who had spent decades perfecting his smooth, practiced delivery. He argued with polished confidence that the bonds were the personal property of Marcus Hartwell, and while they were technically stolen, they were never legally recovered by the authorities. Because the bonds never officially left Hartwell's possession, Richardson claims they remained part of his private estate, giving the family a legitimate right to every cent. The state treasurer's office brought a much different perspective to the bench. Their argument was built on the cold clarity of unclaimed property law, which dictates that any bonds without a verified owner must default to the state. For decades, the system has worked by having the state hold these assets and invest them until a rightful heir can prove their claim. It was a mechanical, bureaucratic argument that treated the fortune like a math problem rather than a piece of a broken town. But Evelyn's lawyer, Sarah Chen, decided to fight for something else entirely. She stood before the judge and argued that the Millbrook City Council had deliberately hidden those bonds as part of a massive, decades-long cover-up. That silence had protected the reputations of a few powerful men, while the rest of the town suffered the consequences. Sarah insisted the bonds shouldn't be sold off or handed to the state, but should instead be held in a trust, specifically for Millbrook, to repair the damage 60 years of secrets had caused. What started as a property dispute quickly transformed into something no one in the room expected. It became a public referendum on the history of Millbrook, a deep dive into why the town had withered away and what might have been different if the money had stayed. The witnesses who took the stand brought the past back to life. One man, an 83-year-old former employee of the planning office, spoke with hands that shook as he pointed to the yellowed documents. He testified that the city council knew exactly what they were burying in that desk, and they chose to hide the truth to protect the town's image. His voice was thin but certain when he told the court that those leaders were wrong, and the weight of his regret filled the silent room. An economist followed him, presenting a series of charts and data that painted a haunting picture of what could have been. She showed how an infrastructure investment back in 1936 could have completely changed the trajectory for a place like Millbrook. If those bonds had been liquidated and used for roads, water systems, and new industries, the economic collapse might have been avoided, or at least delayed long enough for the town to adapt. Instead of building a future, the town's potential lay dormant in a locked drawer, while the streets outside slowly turned to ghosts. The Hartwell family lawyer tried to pivot by arguing that his clients knew nothing about their father's old crimes. He painted Marcus Hartwell as a respected businessman and argued the children shouldn't be punished for sins they didn't commit. It was a sympathetic, reasonable point to make, but it failed to answer the one question that actually mattered. Who did this money really belong to? The judge took 2 weeks to deliberate before returning with a ruling that functioned as a complicated compromise. She declared the bonds were unclaimed property, but instead of giving them to the state, she ordered them to be held in a special trust for Millbrook. The town could finally use the money for economic development, but only under strict oversight and with the full approval of the community. Every dollar spent had to go toward projects that address the specific harm caused by those 60 years of silence. The Hartwells immediately filed an appeal, claiming the ruling violated their basic property rights. The case moved up to the state Supreme Court, where it sat in a legal limbo of motions and duplicate briefs for 2 long years. When the final word finally came down, the appeal was denied, and the original ruling stood as the law of the land. Evelyn didn't feel like celebrating when she attended the city council meeting to watch them officially accept the bonds. The chamber was packed with people who hadn't stepped foot in a council meeting in years, along with former residents who travelled back just to witness the vote. When the council voted unanimously to create the Millbrook Community Development Fund, the room erupted in a way that felt like a long-held breath finally being released. The first round of projects was announced just 3 months later. The old library on Elm Street was slated for a total renovation to become a community centre, and the dusty reference room would be turned into a public reading space. They also established a scholarship fund for students whose families had once laboured in the mills, the ones who stayed behind and wanted to understand why everyone else had to leave. Evelyn sat in the very back of the chamber during that final vote, feeling a strange shift deep inside her chest. It wasn't the light feeling of relief she expected, but something much heavier and more substantial. It felt like the crushing weight of that old desk was finally bearing fruit for the people who had lost the most. 6 months after the court's final ruling, Evelyn walked through the front doors of the newly reopened Millbrook Public Library. The building on Elm Street looked transformed, with the brickwork scrubbed clean and the windows polished until they were clear again. Inside, the old reference room had been turned into a bright reading area lined with black and white photographs of the town's history. There were pictures of the mills at full capacity, portraits of local families, and shots of downtown streets that used to be crowded with life. The desk was positioned right there in the center of the room, fully restored and looking like a piece of history. A small plaque mounted on the front told its story in a few hundred words, and though Evelyn felt the text didn't quite capture the emotional weight of the journey, it told the truth. In a town built on secrets, seeing the truth written down and displayed for everyone was more than enough. She reached out and ran her palm across the wood, noticing that the old stain was still there, faint but visible under the new finish. It was a permanent mark of everything that had been hidden away, a reminder that some things simply won't wash away no matter how hard you scrub. Some scars are meant to stay. The director of the centre, a woman named Lisa, mentioned that the number of people visiting the building had already tripled since the opening. People were coming in to research their family trees, to read the news, or just to sit in the quiet and remember the town as it once was. They were there to imagine a version of Millbrook that could actually exist again. In its very first year, the scholarship fund had already awarded money to 47 local students. Lisa pointed toward a young woman named Michelle, who was hunched over a textbook at one of the new tables in the corner. Michelle's grandmother had spent 32 years working in the mill before the doors closed for good. Her parents had left Millbrook in the 80s to find work and never looked back, but Michelle had chosen to return. She was there to study local history and figure out if there was a way to rebuild the community her family had been forced to abandon. During the opening ceremony, Michelle found Evelyn and thanked her, her eyes welling up with tears as she spoke. Evelyn held the young woman's hand firmly, but she found herself without any words to offer, so she simply stayed silent and let the moment hang between them. The Hartwell name was nowhere to be found on any of the plaques or dedications in the new centre. Instead, the archives featured a prominent section dedicated to the embezzlement scandal, filled with copies of the original ledgers, letters, and photographs. The truth was no longer buried in a basement or hidden in a false bottom. It was just there, out in the open, waiting for anyone who wanted to understand it. Evelyn spent an afternoon sitting in the reading room, just watching the way people moved through the space. She saw a teenager digging into mill records and an elderly couple sharing a newspaper, while a man stood silently in front of the photos, tracing the faces of people he used to know. She thought about that desk and how it had spent 56 years carrying secrets that didn't belong to it. It had been waiting all that time for someone to notice, for someone to care enough to look past the grime and refuse the easy answers. When her daughter eventually visited the centre with the grandchildren, she took a moment to apologise for ever calling Evelyn's decision hoarding. They stood together in front of the heavy wooden piece, and her daughter whispered that Evelyn must have just known something was wrong from the start. Evelyn didn't bother to correct her or explain the long nights of doubt. She just thought about what she actually knew, that some things in this world are too heavy to just walk away from, even when everyone else is telling you they're worthless. That heavy desk still sits in the quiet of the library reading room, its secret compartment now sealed forever. Evelyn returns to this spot sometimes, running her fingers along the grain and feeling the phantom weight of a stain that no amount of scrubbing can ever truly erase. The bonds have all been cashed in and poured into the town's future, but the wood itself stays behind as a silent witness to the choices we make. It isn't a matter of whether she did the right thing, because the real question is what you would have done if that fortune was resting in your hands.